The cold November wind cut through the empty streets of Detroit as I parked my pickup truck in front of Riverside Storage. It was a Tuesday morning, and the morning fog still hung over the rusted rooftops of the industrial complex. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 35 years old and I work as a mechanic at a shop in the suburb of Dearborn. My life was simple. Wake up at 6, work until 5, come home and watch TV with a cold beer. But that morning would be different. Lot 47. "Who'll give me 50? Shouted the auctioneer, a stocky man in a plaid jacket that looked like it had seen better days. I was there out of curiosity. My neighbor Bob always talked about these abandoned storage auctions. "It's like a lottery, Marcus," he'd say. "You never know what you're going to find." Unit 47 had been locked up for over 15 years. The metal door was covered in rust, and there was a faded yellow tape that read, "Delinquent," stuck to the padlock. $50. "Do I hear 60? I looked around. There were about 20 people in the small crowd. Some looked like experienced buyers with flashlights and notepads. Others were just curious like me. $60, shouted a middle-aged woman in a leather coat. I felt a strange impulse. Maybe it was the strong coffee I'd had at Tim Hortons on the way to the auction, or maybe it was the fact that I'd just received my year-end bonus. I raised my hand. 70! The woman looked at me with annoyance but didn't counter. The auctioneer looked around once more. $70. 75. Anyone? The silence hung heavy for a few seconds. I could hear distant traffic from I-75 and the sound of construction machinery working somewhere nearby. "Sold?" to the guy in the red flannel for $70. I didn't know whether to smile or immediately regret it. Bob patted me on the back. "First time's always exciting," he said, laughing. 30 minutes later, I was standing in front of Unit 47 with the keys in my hand. The new padlock they'd put on for the auction opened easily, but when I pulled the metal door up, it resisted with a loud groan that echoed through the empty hallway. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't exactly mold, it was something deeper, like time itself had settled in there. I grabbed the flashlight I'd bought on the way and turned it on. The beam of light revealed a space about 10 by 12 feet, stacked floor to ceiling with brown cardboard boxes, black trash bags, and some furniture covered with dusty sheets. "Well, doesn't look like treasure," I muttered to myself, but something made me step inside. That's when I felt it, a strange sensation, like the air inside the unit was thicker, charged with something I couldn't identify. It was like every breath brought memories that weren't mine. I started opening the first boxes. Old clothes, yellow dress shirts, ties that looked like they were from the 80s, cracked leather shoes. There were stacks of Detroit Free Press newspapers from 1995 to 2008. Old radios that probably didn't work anymore. What a disappointment, I thought. I was almost ready to call the Goodwill folks to come pick everything up when I saw something at the back of the unit. It was a dark wooden chest, almost hidden behind an old bookshelf. It had metal locks that looked solid, even after all these years. When I ran my hand over the surface, I felt carvings in the wood. Initials. RT. My heart skipped a beat. My father's name was Robert Thompson, but this was impossible. My dad never had money to rent a storage unit. He worked his whole life as a factory worker at Ford, came home exhausted every night. He died of a heart attack 5 years ago, leaving behind only debts and a mortgaged house we had to sell. I dragged the chest to the entrance of the unit where there was more light. It was heavy, at least 45 pounds. I grabbed a screwdriver from my toolbox and started working on the old locks. After 15 minutes of effort, I heard the satisfying click of metal giving way. I lifted the lid slowly, and what I saw inside would change my life forever. Photographs, hundreds of them, organized in manila envelopes with dates written in my father's familiar handwriting. The first envelope read, "Christmas 1987, Sarah's first Christmas." Sarah? I didn't have a sister named Sarah. Hell, I didn't have any sisters at all. It was just me and my younger brother Jake. With trembling hands, I pulled out the first photograph. There was my father, looking about 10 years younger, sitting on a couch I'd never seen before. He was smiling, genuinely smiling in a way I rarely saw at home. Next to him sat a woman with curly brown hair and kind eyes, holding a baby girl with a red bow in her hair. My throat felt tight. I flipped through more photos. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family barbecues, all featuring my father with this other family. The woman appeared to be his age, and there were 3 children in total, the girl Sarah and 2 boys who looked to be around my age. At the bottom of the envelope I found a letter addressed to my other family in my father's distinctive block lettering. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely open it. "My dearest Linda and kids," it began. "I know this situation isn't ideal, but you three are the light of my life. I wish I could be there for every moment, every milestone, every scraped knee and report card. Please know that even when I'm not there, you're always in my thoughts. Love always, Dad." I sat back on my heels staring at the letter. The concrete floor of the storage unit felt cold through my jeans. Around me, the boxes and bags suddenly felt like they were closing in, each one potentially holding more secrets, more lies, more evidence of a life I never knew existed. For 35 years, I thought I knew who Robert Thompson was. He was my father, a quiet, hard-working man who left early for the plant and came home late, smelling like motor oil and exhaustion. A man who rarely smiled, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. A man who we always thought was struggling to provide for just one family, but apparently he'd been providing for two. I grabbed another envelope, this one marked Linda's birthday, 1993. More photos of celebrations I was never part of a father I barely recognized laughing and playing with children who weren't me and Jake. The November afternoon light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the storage facility. I could hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional slam of another storage unit door as other auction winners examined their purchases. But I sat there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the pieces of my father's secret life, feeling like everything I thought I knew about my family, my childhood, and my father had just crumbled into dust. How long had this been going on? How had he managed to keep two families for what looked like decades? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information now? As I carefully placed the photos back in the chest, one more envelope caught my eye. This one was different, newer paper, and the handwriting was less steady, like it had been written by an older, shakier hand. The envelope was marked, "For my boys, if something happens to me." I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. The handwriting was definitely my father's, but it looked like it had been written not long before he died. The letters were slightly trembled, the way his hands had gotten in his final years when the arthritis started setting in. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, the kind he used to use for making his grocery lists. But this wasn't a list of milk and bread. "Marcus and Jake," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and somehow you found this place. I always hoped you never would, but I guess deep down I knew one of you might stumble across it someday. I don't expect you to understand, and I sure as hell don't expect you to forgive me. What I did was wrong, and I've carried that weight every single day for over 20 years. Your mother never knew. I made damn sure of that. She was a good woman, too good for me, and she deserved better than what I gave her. But I was weak, and I made choices that I can't undo. In 1985, I met Linda at a bar in Pontiac after a particularly bad fight with your mom. We were going through a rough patch. Money was tight, you boys were young and demanding, and I felt like I was drowning. Linda was kind, she listened, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone actually saw me. What started as one night turned into something more. When she got pregnant with Sarah, I should have come clean. Should have left your mother or left Linda. Made a choice. But I was a coward. I couldn't bear the thought of breaking up either family, so I tried to maintain both. For 23 years, I lived two lives. Monday through Friday, I was Robert Thompson, factory worker married to Janet, father to Marcus and Jake. Weekends, I was Bobby, Linda's partner, father to Sarah, Michael and David. I told Linda I worked construction jobs on the weekends, traveling for work. I told your mother I was pulling overtime shifts at the plant. The lies came so easily after a while that I almost started believing them myself. This storage unit became my hiding place. All the birthday gifts I couldn't bring home, the Christmas photos I couldn't hang on our walls, the evidence of the life I was living in secret, it all ended up here. I know you're probably angry. You have every right to be. You probably feel like you never really knew me, and you're right. I don't even know if I knew myself anymore by the end. Sarah is 28 now, Michael is 26, and David is 24. They think their father died in a construction accident 2 years ago. I couldn't even be honest in death. Linda lives at 1247 Maple Street in Pontiac. She's a good woman, Marcus. They're good people. If you decide to find them, and I understand if you don't, please be gentle. They're grieving too. I'm sorry, boys. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. I'm sorry for all the times I was distant, all the weekends I wasn't there, all the lies. I loved you both, and I loved them too. That was my curse. I loved too much, and too poorly. The key to safety deposit box 347 at First National Bank of Pontiac is taped to the bottom of this chest. There's enough money there to take care of Linda and the kids for a while. It's the least I can do. Do with this information what you think is right. I can't ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. But if you can find it in your hearts to understand, maybe that's enough. Your father, Robert Thompson. I read the letter 3 times before the words really sank in. My hands were numb from the cold, but I couldn't feel anything anyway. It was like my entire nervous system had shut down. I had 3 half-siblings I'd never met. My father had maintained a second family for over 2 decades. My mother had gone to her grave never knowing that her husband was living a double life. The sun was setting now, casting the storage facility in an orange glow that made everything look surreal. I could hear Bob calling my name from somewhere across the complex. He'd probably finished going through his own purchase and was wondering where I'd disappeared to. But I couldn't move. I sat there on the cold concrete, holding my father's confession, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My phone buzzed. A text from Jake. How'd the auction go? Find anything good? How was I supposed to answer that? Yeah. Found out Dad had a secret family for 23 years. Also found out we have 3 half-siblings living in Pontiac. No big deal. Instead, I typed back, still going through stuff. Call you later. I looked at the address my father had written down. 1247 Maple Street in Pontiac. That was only about 20 miles from here. These people, my half-siblings, they were practically neighbors, and I'd never known they existed. What were they like? Did Sarah have Dad's stubborn streak? Did Michael share his love for old cars? Did David have his laugh? The rare, genuine one I only heard a few times in my life. And Linda, what kind of woman was she? What had she seen in my father that made her willing to accept a part-time relationship for over 20 years? Had she known he was married, or had that been another lie? I pulled out my phone and found myself typing 1247 Maple Street, Pontiac into Google Maps before I could stop myself. The satellite view showed a small, well-maintained house with a red front door and what looked like a vegetable garden in the backyard. Marcus, you okay over there? Bob's voice was getting closer. I quickly shoved the letter back into the envelope and closed the chest. Yeah, just found some interesting stuff. When Bob appeared at the entrance to the unit, I was pretending to sort through one of the boxes of old clothes. Anything valuable? He asked, shining his flashlight around the space. Not sure yet, I said, which was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone all day. Lot of personal stuff. Might take a while to go through it all. Well, you got until tomorrow to clear it out, remember? Facility rules. He clapped me on the shoulder. Want some help loading this stuff into your truck? I looked at the chest, then at the dozens of boxes surrounding us. Each one potentially held more secrets, more evidence of my father's double life. I needed time to process this, to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. Actually, yeah, that'd be great. We spent the next hour loading everything into my pickup. The chest went in last, wrapped in one of the dusty sheets from the unit. I told Bob it was just old family photos, which wasn't entirely a lie. As I drove home through the darkening streets of Detroit, the chest riding in my truck bed, I kept thinking about that address in Pontiac, about Sarah, Michael, and David, about Linda, who thought her partner of 23 years had died in a construction accident. My phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen. Hey, Jake. So what did you find? Anything cool? I looked in my rearview mirror at the covered chest. You could say that. Listen, can you come over tonight? There's something we need to talk about. Sure, sounds serious. Everything okay? I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, staring at my small ranch house. It looked exactly the same as when I'd left that morning, but somehow everything felt different now. I'm not sure, I told my brother honestly. I'll see you in an hour. As I carried the chest into my house, I couldn't help but wonder, was I about to destroy 2 more families with the truth, or was I about to bring them together? And did I have the right to make that choice for people who didn't even know I existed? The chest sat in my living room like a time bomb, and I had no idea when it was going to explode. Jake arrived at my house 45 minutes later, with a 6-pack of Budweiser and a bag of chips, like he was coming over to watch a game. He had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down, just like mine had been. My younger brother was 32, worked in IT for a small company in Southfield, and had always been the more easygoing one between us. Where I tended to overthink everything, Jake rolled with the punches. He was going to need that attitude tonight. So what's the big mystery? He asked, settling into my recliner and cracking open a beer. You sounded weird on the phone. I'd spent the last hour pacing around my living room, trying to figure out how to break this news. There was no easy way to tell someone that everything they thought they knew about their father was a lie. The chest sat on my coffee table between us, still covered with the dusty sheet. "Remember how Dad used to work those weekend overtime shifts?" I started. Jake nodded. "Yeah, every Saturday and Sunday for as long as I can remember. Mom used to complain he was never around for family stuff. He wasn't working overtime, Jake." My brother looked at me confused. "What do you mean?" I pulled the sheet off the chest. "I mean, he was with his other family." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jake stared at the chest, then at me, then back at the chest. "His what now?" I opened the chest and pulled out the first envelope of photos. "Dad had another family, Jake. A woman named Linda and 3 kids. For over 20 years. Jake set his beer down slowly. Marcus, that's not funny. Do I look like I'm joking?" I handed him the envelope. He opened it with the same trembling hands I'd had at the storage unit. I watched his face change as he went through the photos. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, a kind of hollow shock. "This is Dad," he said quietly, holding up a photo of our father teaching a young boy to ride a bike. "But that's not us." "No, it's not." Jake set the photos down and rubbed his face with both hands. How did you find this?" I told him about the storage auction, about finding the chest, about the letter. When I handed him Dad's confession, Jake read it twice in complete silence. "A safety deposit box," he finally said. "There's money. That's what you're focused on right now?" "I'm trying to process this, Marcus." Jake stood up and started pacing. Our dad who could barely afford Christmas presents some years, had enough money to maintain 2 families and rent a storage unit for 15 years. He was right. That part didn't make sense either. Dad had always claimed money was tight. We'd eaten a lot of mac and cheese dinners, worn hand-me-down clothes, drove cars that were held together with duct tape and prayer. "Maybe Linda had money," I suggested. "Or maybe he was stealing from Ford." Jake sat back down heavily. "Jesus, Marcus, what are we supposed to do with this?" I'd been asking myself the same question all afternoon. "I don't know. Do we tell Mom? Mom's been dead for 3 years, Jake. I meant..." He paused. "I don't know what I meant. My brain isn't working right." We sat in silence for a while, both of us staring at the evidence of our father's secret life spread across my coffee table. The photos looked so normal, so happy. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. The kind of memories we had with Dad too, except these people seemed to get the version of him that actually smiled. "They think he's dead," Jake said eventually. "Been dead for 2 years, according to the letter. So we have 3 siblings who are mourning a father who actually died 3 years later than they think. Half-siblings," I corrected, though I wasn't sure why that distinction mattered. Jake picked up another photo. This one showed our father pushing a little girl on a swing set. "She looks like Dad. Around the eyes." He was right. Sarah had the same deep-set brown eyes, the same stubborn chin. So do the boys. "What are their names again?" "Sarah, Michael, and David." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I keep thinking about all those Saturday mornings when we asked Dad to take us fishing or to a Tigers game, and he'd say he had to work. He wasn't working. He was with them." The hurt in his voice was obvious. I felt it too, a deep ache that went beyond anger into something more complicated. It wasn't just that Dad had lied to us. It was that he'd chosen to spend his free time with another family while we waited at home for scraps of his attention. "You know what's messed up?" Jake continued. "I'm jealous of kids I've never met." "I know. Look at this photo." He held up a picture of Dad and the 2 boys working on what looked like a go-kart in a garage. "When did he ever build anything with us?" "Never. But he built go-karts with them." I could see Jake was spiraling into the same dark thoughts I'd been having. "Maybe we should go see them." Jake looked at me like I'd suggested we rob a bank. "What?" "Linda and the kids, maybe we should go see them." "And say what?" "Hi, we're the sons your dead boyfriend never told you about?" "I don't know. But they're our family, Jake. Like it or not. Half family. Still family." Jake picked up the letter again, scanning through it. "He says Linda thinks he died in a construction accident 2 years ago. That means she's been grieving for 2 years for someone who was actually still alive. And then he actually died. And she never knew. God, that's so screwed up." Jake crumpled up his beer can. "What kind of man does this to people?" "Our father, apparently." We went through more of the photos in silence. There were hundreds of them, documenting over 2 decades of birthdays, holidays, graduations, and ordinary moments. In every single one, our father looked happy. in a way I rarely remembered seeing at home. "I want to hate him," Jake said quietly. "Me too. But look at this." He held up a photo of Dad reading to a small Sarah, both of them laughing at something in the book. "Look how happy she looks. Look how happy he looks." I see it. These kids, they loved him. He was a good father to them, but not to us. No, not to us. That was the knife that twisted in my gut. It wasn't just that Dad had another family. It was that he'd apparently been a better father to them than he'd been to us. The man who was too tired to play catch with me after work had energy to build go-karts with Michael and David. The man who rarely spoke at our dinner table was reading bedtime stories to Sarah. "There's something else," Jake said, pulling out an envelope I hadn't seen before. "Look at the dates on these." The envelope was marked Sarah's high school graduation, 2015. That's only 10 years ago, I realized. Jake nodded. Dad didn't stop seeing them when we grew up and moved out. He kept going right up until he died, which means Linda was probably expecting to see him the weekend he had his heart attack. She probably waited for him to show up. Jake's voice was getting tight. Probably called and called when he didn't come. And then what? She never found out what happened to him. I thought about Linda, sitting in that house on Maple Street, wondering why the man she'd been with for over 20 years had just vanished. Wondering if he'd left her, if he'd found someone else, if something terrible had happened to him. The truth was, something terrible had happened to him, but she'd never known it. "We have to tell them," I said. Jake looked at me. "Tell them what?" "The truth. About who Dad really was, about us, about how he really died." "Marcus, that'll destroy them." "They're already destroyed. At least this way they'll know the truth." Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "What if they hate us? For what? For existing. For taking away half their father for 23 years. I'd thought about that too. What if they hate Dad instead? What if they do? Jake turned back to me. Is that fair to them? They've been mourning him as this great guy who died too young. Do we have the right to take that away from them? Do we have the right not to? Jake didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. My phone buzzed with a text. Jake's girlfriend asking when he was coming home. The normal world was still moving around us, full of people whose fathers hadn't lived double lives for decades. "I need to think about this," Jake said finally. "How long?" "I don't know. A few days, a week. This is..." He gestured at the chest and all the photos. "This is huge, Marcus. This changes everything." He was right. But as I watched him gather his things and head for the door, I realized I'd already made my decision. I was going to 1247 Maple Street in Pontiac. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but soon. I needed to look Linda in the eyes and see the woman my father had loved enough to lie for over 2 decades. I needed to meet Sarah, Michael, and David and understand what kind of people they were. Most importantly, I needed to decide whether the truth would set us all free or destroy whatever peace they'd managed to find in their grief. As Jake's taillights disappeared down my street, I sat back down with the photos. In one of them, Dad was teaching Michael how to tie a tie, probably for a school dance or graduation. Michael looked to be about 16, the same age I was when I'd had to figure out how to tie a tie by watching YouTube videos. That's when I realized something that made my chest tight with anger and grief. Our father hadn't just failed us. He'd succeeded with them, and somehow that felt like the biggest betrayal of all. 3 days later, I found myself parked across the street from 1247 Maple Street in Pontiac at 6:30 a.m., drinking gas station coffee and questioning my sanity. I'd told myself I was just going to drive by just to see the house, just to get a sense of where my father's other family lived. But here I was, sitting in my truck like some kind of stalker, watching a red front door and waiting for signs of life. The house was smaller than I'd expected, a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters. The yard was well maintained, with flower beds that looked like someone actually cared about them. There was a Honda Civic in the driveway, maybe 10 years old but clean, and what looked like a vegetable garden along the side of the house. It was the kind of house that looked like a home, the kind of place where people had dinner together and helped each other with homework, the kind of place I'd always wished I'd grown up in. At 7:15, the front door opened, and a woman stepped out to grab the newspaper from the front porch. She was maybe in her late 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing scrubs, probably a nurse or healthcare worker. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this same routine thousands of times. This had to be Linda. I found myself studying her face, trying to see what my father had seen. She wasn't what I'd call beautiful, but she had a kind face, the sort of person who probably remembered your birthday and asked about your day like she actually cared about the answer. She glanced around the street as she picked up the paper, and for a terrifying moment I thought she might notice me, but her gaze passed right over my truck and she went back inside. 20 minutes later, a young man came out the front door, probably in his mid-20s. He was tall and lean with dark hair and our father's distinctive nose. He got into the Honda and backed out of the driveway, probably heading to work. Michael or David, I guessed, one of my half-brothers. I followed him at a distance, telling myself I was just curious about where he worked. He drove to a construction site about 10 minutes away, parked, and grabbed a hard hat and tool belt from his trunk. So he really was in construction. Unlike our father, who just used that as a cover story. I watched him joke around with other workers as they gathered for what looked like a morning briefing. He seemed well-liked, the kind of guy who probably bought rounds at the bar after work and remembered his co-workers' kids' names. My phone rang. "Jake, where are you?" he asked without preamble. "Nowhere." "Marcus, are you in Pontiac?" I didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, what are you doing?" "I'm just looking." "You're stalking them." "I'm not stalking anyone, I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" I watched Michael, or David, demonstrate something to a younger worker, patient and encouraging, in a way that reminded me of the father I'd seen in those photos. What Dad saw in them. Jake was quiet for a moment. "And? They look happy, normal, the kind of family you see in commercials for minivans." "Marcus, you need to come home." "Maybe. Not maybe. Now. Before you do something stupid." But I was already doing something stupid. As soon as I hung up, I drove back to Maple Street and parked in the same spot. I told myself I'd just wait another hour, see if anyone else came or went. At noon, the Honda returned. Michael, or David, was back for lunch, apparently, but this time, he wasn't alone. A young woman got out of the passenger side, mid-20s, with our father's dark eyes, and a smile that lit up her whole face. Sarah. They walked into the house together, and I could hear their laughter even from across the street. It was the kind of easy, comfortable laughter that came from people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I found myself thinking about Jake and me. When was the last time we'd laughed like that? When was the last time we'd had lunch together just because we wanted to? A few minutes later, another car pulled up. An older sedan, probably 15 years old but well-maintained. A young man got out, slightly shorter than the first one, with lighter hair but the same basic build. So that was Michael and David. Both of them had come home for lunch. Through the front window, I could see movement inside the house. The three siblings and Linda gathered around what looked like a kitchen table, sharing a meal and conversation. I sat there for 45 minutes, watching my father's other family live their life, and felt something I hadn't expected: envy. Not just because Dad had chosen them over us for his free time, but because they had something Jake and I had never really had. They had each other. They functioned as a unit, a team, a real family. Jake and I, we loved each other, I guess, but we weren't close. We saw each other on holidays and birthdays, maybe grabbed a beer once a month. We'd grown up in the same house, but lived separate lives. But these three, Sarah, Michael, and David, they had lunch together on a Wednesday afternoon. They probably called each other when they had good news or bad news. They probably knew each other's favorite foods and biggest fears and secret dreams. They'd had what I'd always wanted, siblings who were also friends. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Are you going to sit there all day, or are you going to come in and introduce yourself?" My blood went cold. I looked up at the house and saw Sarah standing in the front window, looking directly at me. She waved and held up her phone. How had she gotten my number? Another text. "Your truck has been parked across from our house for 3 hours. Either you're lost, or you're one of the Thompson boys Dad told us about." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. She knew. They knew about us. A third text. "Mom's making sandwiches. There's enough for one more." I looked back at the house. Sarah was still in the window, but now Linda was standing next to her. They were both looking at me, not with anger or fear, but with what looked like curiosity, hope. My hands were shaking as I typed back, "How did you know? You look like Dad. Same stubborn jaw, same way of sitting when you're thinking too hard about something." Plus, came another message, "Your truck is registered to Marcus Thompson, and there aren't that many Thompsons in Detroit who'd be stalking our house." I looked at my truck registration hanging from my rearview mirror and felt like an idiot. Of course, they'd been able to see my name, but that meant they'd known who I was the whole time I'd been sitting there. They'd watched me watching them, and instead of calling the police or confronting me, they'd made lunch. Another text. Doors unlocked. Come on in. We've been waiting 20 years to meet you. 20 years? But that would mean, holy shit, they'd known about us all along. I sat in my truck for another 5 minutes, staring at the house, trying to process what this meant. If they'd known about Jake and me for 20 years, that changed everything. They weren't innocent victims who'd been lied to. They were, what, co-conspirators? Fellow victims? There was only one way to find out. I got out of my truck on legs that felt like jelly, crossed Maple Street, and walked up to the front door of 1247. Before I could knock, it swung open. Linda stood there wearing the same scrubs I'd seen earlier, but now I could see her face clearly. She had laugh lines around her eyes, and a mouth that looked like it smiled often. She was studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. You're taller than I expected, but you have his hands." She stepped aside. "Come on in. The kids are dying to meet you." As I walked into the house that my father had called home for over 20 years, I realized that everything I thought I'd figured out was wrong. The story was so much more complicated than I'd imagined. The inside of the house smelled like fresh bread and coffee, with hints of the kind of air freshener that's trying to mask years of good cooking rather than bad smells. The living room was cozy without being cluttered, mismatched furniture that somehow worked together, family photos covering every available surface, and a bookshelf that actually looked like it was used for reading. It felt like a home in a way my childhood house never had. Sarah appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, carrying a plate of sandwiches. Up close, she was even more obviously our father's daughter. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw when she was thinking. "Turkey and Swiss, okay?" she asked, setting the plate on the coffee table. "Mom wasn't sure what you'd like." That's fine. Thank you." Michael and David emerged from the kitchen together, and seeing the three of them standing side by side made my chest tight. They looked like siblings in a way that Jake and I never had. Same general build, same coloring, same easy way of moving around each other. "I'm Michael," said the one I'd seen at the construction site, extending his hand. "David," said the other, doing the same. Their handshakes were firm, confident, the kind of men who knew who they were and where they belonged in the world. "I'm Marcus," I managed. "We know," Sarah said with a slight smile. "We've known about you and Jake our whole lives." I sat down heavily on the couch. "How?" Linda settled into a chair across from me. "Your father told us about you from the beginning. You and Jake were never a secret, Marcus. You were just complicated." "Complicated how?" Michael sat down on the other end of the couch. "Dad said your mother was a good woman, but she was rigid, traditional. She wouldn't have understood about us." "Understood what exactly?" The three siblings exchanged a look, and Linda sighed. "Marcus, your father never lied to me about being married. I knew about Janet from our second date." The room felt like it was spinning. "You knew he was married?" "Of course I knew, and I made a choice to be with him anyway." "But it's why?" Sarah sat down in the chair next to her mother. "Because he was a good man who was stuck in a bad situation. Because he loved all of us, you and Jake included. And because sometimes love doesn't fit into neat little boxes." I stared at her. "He abandoned us every weekend to be with you." "No," David said quietly. "He worked 2 jobs to support 2 families. Monday through Friday, he worked at Ford to pay for your house, your food, your clothes, your school supplies. Weekends, he worked construction to pay for ours." "Construction?" "Yeah, construction. He really did work construction on weekends." That wasn't a lie. Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. Here he is at a job site in 2010. The photo showed our father in a hard hat and work clothes, covered in dust, standing next to a half-built house. He looked exhausted but proud. "But he lived here on weekends," I said, confused. "Sometimes," Linda said, "when he could. But most weekends he worked from dawn to dusk, then came here for dinner and to help with homework. He'd leave again at 6 a.m. Monday morning to get to Ford on time." I tried to process this. "So he was working 7 days a week?" 7 days a week for over 20 years, Sarah confirmed, "to support both families without either of us going without." "But we did go without," I said, my voice getting tight. "We wore second-hand clothes. We ate mac and cheese for dinner half the time. We couldn't afford family vacations or new cars or—" "And you think we lived in luxury?" David laughed, but not unkindly. "Marcus, look around. Does this look like the house of someone with money?" He was right. The furniture was old, but well-maintained. The carpet was worn in places. The TV was ancient by modern standards. "Dad split everything down the middle," Michael explained. If he made $800 a week, $400 went to your family and $400 went to ours. If there was a bonus at Christmas, half went to your mom and half came here. We shopped at the same thrift stores you did, Sarah added, ate the same mac and cheese dinners. The only difference was, Dad was here to eat them with us on Sundays. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. He chose you. No, Linda said firmly. He chose all of you. That was the problem. He couldn't choose, so he tried to be everything to everyone, and it nearly killed him. What do you mean? 3 heart attacks, Marcus. Your father had 3 heart attacks. The first one was in 2008 when you were in college. The second was in 2015 when Sarah graduated high school. The third one killed him. I didn't know about the first 2 because he didn't want to worry anyone. He just kept working, kept carrying the weight of 2 families on his shoulders, kept pretending everything was fine. Sarah leaned forward. Do you want to know what he was really like? Dad wasn't some deadbeat who abandoned his first family for a newer model. He was a man who fell in love twice and couldn't bear to hurt anyone, so he hurt himself instead. Tell me, I said quietly. He carried pictures of you and Jake in his wallet, she said. He knew your grades, your girlfriends' names, what you wanted to be when you grew up. He worried about you constantly. He never showed it, because he was exhausted, Marcus. By the time he got home to you guys on weekday evenings, he'd already put in 8 hours at Ford. He was running on empty, but he was still showing up. Linda got up and retrieved a photo album from the bookshelf. He brought pictures of you boys every time he came here, she said, opening it. The album was full of photos I recognized. My high school graduation, Jake's wedding, family Christmas mornings. But they were wallet-sized copies, the kind you get made at CVS. This was you at your first job, Sarah said, pointing to a photo of me in a mechanic's uniform. Dad was so proud. He said you'd figured out how to fix anything with an engine, just like he had. And this is Jake on his wedding day, David added. Dad cried looking at this photo. Said Jake looked happier than he'd ever seen him. I stared at the album, filled with moments from my life that I'd never imagined my father documenting. He talked about us. All the time, Michael said. We probably know more about you and Jake than you know about us. Dad made sure we understood that you guys weren't the enemy. You were our brothers, who just happened to live in a different house. We wanted to meet you, Sarah said. Growing up, we begged Dad to arrange it somehow, but he said it would be too complicated, that it might hurt your mum. Did he love her? My mum? Linda was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he did. Just differently than he loved me. Janet was his first love, his young love, the mother of his first children. I was his second chance at happiness, but he never forgot his first responsibility. When Mum died, we thought maybe... David trailed off. Maybe what? Maybe he'd tell you about us then. Maybe we could all be a real family. Sarah's voice was wistful. But then he had his second heart attack, and he said the stress of your mum's death and Jake's divorce was enough. He didn't want to add to it. Jake got divorced. 2 years ago, Dad said it was pretty rough on him. I'd known about Jake's divorce, of course, but I hadn't realized Dad had known. We'd never talked about it. Dad had been sick by then, and we'd kept our conversations light. What happened when Dad died? I asked. Linda said you thought he died in a construction accident. Michael grimaced. That was our fault. When Dad didn't show up that weekend and we couldn't reach him, we got worried. David drove to the construction site where Dad had been working, and the foreman said there'd been an accident with a worker who matched Dad's description. We went to the hospital, but they said the man had died, and the body had already been released to his family. Linda's voice was tight. We assumed that meant us, but when we went to the funeral home, they said they'd never heard of Robert Thompson, Sarah finished. We thought there'd been a mix-up, or maybe Dad had been working under a different name. We spent weeks trying to find out what happened to him, and then we just gave up, David said. Figured maybe he'd decided he didn't want this life anymore and moved on. The pain in their voices was obvious. While Jake and I had been dealing with Dad's death and funeral arrangements, his other family had been desperately searching for him, thinking he'd either died anonymously or abandoned them. We had our own memorial service, Linda said quietly. Just the 4 of us. We buried an empty casket in Riverside Cemetery. I thought about my father's real grave, 20 miles away in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. He's buried in Mount Pleasant. Plot 47B. There's a headstone. Sarah started crying. Quiet tears that she wiped away quickly, but tears nonetheless. Can we visit him? She asked. Of course. What does the headstone say? I tried to remember. Robert James Thompson, beloved husband and father, 1952-2018. Beloved husband and father, Michael repeated. That's perfect. That's exactly what he was. We sat in silence for a few minutes, all of us processing the weight of what had been shared. These people weren't the villains I'd built up in my mind. They were victims of the same situation Jake and I were. Loving a man who tried to be everything to everyone and ended up breaking himself in the process. "I have a question," I said finally. "Ask it," Linda replied. "If you knew about us and you know we exist, why didn't you reach out after Dad died? Why didn't you try to find us?" The question seemed to surprise them. "Because," Sarah said slowly, "we figured if you'd wanted to know about us, Dad would have told you. We thought maybe he'd kept us a secret because you wouldn't want to know. We were protecting ourselves," David admitted. "What if we reached out and you guys hated us? What if you blamed us for taking Dad away from you?" "Do you?" Michael asked. "Blame us?" I looked around the room at these three people who shared my DNA, who'd grown up with the father I'd always wished I'd had, who'd been grieving his death for 2 years without knowing he was actually dead. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm still figuring that out." "That's fair," Linda said. "This is a lot to process." "There's something else," I said. "Dad left a safety deposit box. He said there was money for you guys." Sarah and Linda exchanged a look. "How much money?" Linda asked. "I don't know. We haven't opened it yet." "We don't want his money," Michael said firmly. "Why not?" "Because money was what kept him away from all of us," David explained. "Money was what made him work himself to death. We don't want any part of that." I understood the sentiment, but I also understood something they didn't. He worked himself to death because he loved you, all of you. The money isn't guilt, it's love. Linda wiped her eyes. "Maybe. But right now, what we really want is to meet Jake. And maybe we can figure out how to be a family. All of us." As I sat in that living room, surrounded by photos of the father I thought I'd known and the siblings I'd never imagined I had, I realized something important. The story I'd been telling myself about Robert Thompson was wrong. He wasn't a villain who'd abandoned his first family for a second one. He wasn't a deadbeat who'd chosen his own happiness over his responsibilities. He was a man who'd loved too much and too completely, who'd tried to be two people at once, who'd literally worked himself to death trying to provide for everyone he cared about. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop being angry at him for his choices and start figuring out how to honor what he'd tried to build. "I'd like Jake to meet you all," I said. "But I need to warn you, he's going to have questions, a lot of questions." "We have questions too," Sarah said. 20 years worth. I pulled out my phone. "Then let's start getting some answers." 2 weeks later, Jake and I were back in Linda's living room, but this time we weren't alone. The coffee table was covered with photo albums, documents, and the contents of Dad's safety deposit box, which had turned out to contain $47,000 in cash and a life insurance policy that named both families as beneficiaries. The life insurance had been the biggest surprise. Dad had somehow managed to pay premiums on a $200,000 policy for 15 years without either family knowing about it. Half was designated for Janet Thompson and children, and half for Linda Morrison and children. "Even in death, he was trying to take care of everyone," Jake had said when we'd met with the insurance company. Now, as we sat surrounded by the evidence of our father's double life, I was beginning to understand that double life wasn't the right term. It had been one life, lived in two places, with love divided equally even when time and energy couldn't be. Sarah was showing Jake a photo album from her childhood. "This was my first day of kindergarten," she said, pointing to a picture of a tiny girl with pigtails and a nervous smile. "Dad took the morning off work to drive me to school. He never did that for us," Jake said, but there was no bitterness in his voice anymore, just sadness. "Because your mom could do it," Michael pointed out. "Mom was working double shifts at the hospital. Dad had to be our mom and dad for school stuff." It was true. Our mother had been a stay-at-home mom until we were in high school. She'd handled all the school events, parent-teacher conferences, and daily logistics. Dad's absence had been noticeable, but not necessary. "Look at this one," David said, showing us a picture of Dad teaching him to drive. "Parking lot of the Kroger on Telegraph Road. I was 15. Same parking lot where he taught me," Jake realized. "Same exact spot, probably. He had his systems," Linda said with a small smile. "Kroger for driving lessons, Riverside Park for teaching you to ride a bike, the batting cages on Woodward for baseball. You mean he used the same places with all of us?" I asked. "Efficiency," Sarah explained. "Dad was all about efficiency. Why figure out a new way to teach someone to parallel park when you'd already found the perfect empty lot?" Jake laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him since this whole thing started. "That is so Dad. Remember how he had that specific way he liked his tools arranged in the garage? Same exact system in the garage here, Michael confirmed. Screwdrivers organized by size, wrenches in order from smallest to largest. He'd get actually annoyed if you put something back in the wrong place. We thought it was just a dad thing, David added. Didn't realize it was a Thompson family trait until now. As we talked, something strange was happening. The anger and resentment that had been churning in my gut for 2 weeks was slowly transforming into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding, maybe even respect. Our father hadn't been living a lie. He'd been living an impossible truth, trying to be fully present for 2 families when there was only one of him to go around. I keep thinking about the logistics of it, Jake said. How did he keep track of everything? Birthdays, school events, who needed what? Linda got up and retrieved a small notebook from a kitchen drawer. This, she said, handing it to Jake. The notebook was filled with our father's handwriting, dates, names, reminders. Marcus, oil change due 3:15. Jake's birthday, call Tuesday. Sarah, science fair project due Friday. David, soccer practice Saturdays. Michael, dentist appointment Thursday. He wrote down everything, Linda explained. Every important date, every commitment, every promise he made to any of you. I used to tease him about it, but now I understand. It was the only way he could keep track of 5 children's lives when he was only physically present for part of each. Jake flipped through the pages, his expression growing softer. Look at this, he said, pointing to an entry. Marcus, worried about job interview. Call Wednesday to check in. I remembered that interview. I'd been applying for my current position at the shop, and I'd been nervous about it for weeks. Dad had called me the day after to ask how it went. He called you? Sarah asked. Yeah. I thought it was weird because he never called just to chat. It wasn't weird, she said. It was scheduled. Look, she pointed to another entry. Jake, divorce final next week. Check in Friday. He called me that Friday, Jake said quietly. Asked if I wanted to grab a beer. I was surprised because we hadn't hung out in months. Everything was scheduled, Michael realized. Every phone call, every check-in, every moment of caring, it wasn't spontaneous, it was planned. That doesn't make it less real, Linda said firmly. If anything, it makes it more real. How much do you have to love someone to schedule loving them? The room went quiet as we all processed that. I have a confession, Sarah said suddenly. We used to spy on you guys. What? Jake and I said at the same time. Online, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. We'd look up Marcus Thompson and Jake Thompson in Detroit, try to figure out what our half-brothers were like. That's kind of creepy, Jake said. I know, but we were curious. Dad would tell us stories about you, but we wanted to see for ourselves. What did you find? I asked. David grinned. That Marcus posts a lot of pictures of cars he's working on, and Jake shares way too many memes about being divorced. Hey! Jake protested, but he was smiling. Also, Michael added, you both look exactly like Dad did at your age. It was weird seeing photos of him with hair. Dad had hair? Sarah asked, surprised. Jake and I looked at her with identical expressions of disbelief. You never saw pictures of young Dad? I asked. Mom, do we have any pictures of Dad from before we knew him? Sarah asked. Linda shook her head. He said the past was the past. He never talked about his life before us. Jake and I exchanged a look. We have pictures, Jake said. Lots of them. Really? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a photo I'd scanned years ago. Dad at 18, fresh out of high school, with a full head of dark hair and a cocky grin. Oh my God, Sarah breathed. He looks like David. She was right. The resemblance was uncanny. And this is him and Mom on their wedding day, Jake said, showing them another photo. The 3 siblings crowded around to look at the picture of our young parents, dressed in 1970s wedding attire, looking impossibly young and happy. Mom was beautiful, Michael said softly. She was, I agreed. And she stayed beautiful. Dad was lucky to have her. And lucky to have Linda, too, Jake added, which surprised everyone, especially Linda. You think so? She asked. I think Dad was a man who needed a lot of love, Jake said thoughtfully. More than most people, maybe. And I think he was lucky enough to find 2 women who were willing to give it to him, even though it meant sharing him, Linda said. Even though it meant sharing him. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through photos and stories, filling in gaps in each other's understanding of the man who had somehow managed to be a father to all of us, despite the impossible circumstances he'd created. As the day wore on, something became clear. We liked each other, not just as an obligation or because we shared DNA, but genuinely. Sarah had Jake's sense of humor. Michael had my practical problem-solving approach. David had a gentleness that reminded me of the best parts of Dad. "So what happens now?" Linda asked as Jake and I were getting ready to leave. "I don't know," I admitted. "This is all new territory." "Maybe we could have dinner sometime," Sarah suggested. "All of us together, like a family." "We are a family," David said. "Weird and complicated, but still family." "The Thompsons and the Morrisons," Michael added. "Just the Thompsons," Jake corrected. "All of us." As we said our goodbyes and headed back to our cars, Jake grabbed my arm. "You know what's funny?" he said. "What?" "I spent my whole life wishing Dad was different, more present, more involved, more like other dads." He looked back at the house where our half-siblings lived. Turns out he was exactly like that, just not with us. "Are you okay with that?" Jake considered this for a moment. "I'm okay with understanding it. Dad wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a villain either. He was just a man trying to do right by everyone he loved, even when that was impossible. Think we can make this work? All of us? I don't know, but I want to try." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the father I'd spent 35 years trying to understand. Robert Thompson hadn't been the distant, absent man I'd imagined. He'd been present, just stretched thin across 2 families, 2 lives, 2 sets of responsibilities. He'd worked himself to death trying to be enough for everyone, and in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe love didn't have to look like what you expected it to look like. Maybe sometimes love looked like a man who scheduled his caring, who split his paycheck down the middle, who carried pictures of all his children in his wallet, even when he couldn't carry them all in his arms. 3 months later, we had our first Thompson family dinner. All of us, Jake and me, Sarah and Michael and David, Linda and her new boyfriend, who turned out to be a decent guy, who didn't mind inheriting a complicated family situation. We ate at the dining room table in Linda's house, passing around dishes and talking over each other like families do. There were still awkward moments, still things we didn't understand about each other, still grief to work through, but there was also laughter. There were stories. There were inside jokes forming and plans being made, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, Dad had been right to believe that love could stretch wide enough to cover all of us. At the end of the evening, as we were cleaning up, Sarah pulled me aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a photo I'd never seen before, Dad sitting in this very living room, holding a baby. But it wasn't one of his other children. It was me, maybe 6 months old, sleeping in his arms. "When was this taken?" I asked. "Mum found it in his wallet after he died, along with pictures of all of us." Sarah smiled. "I think he wanted us to know that he carried all of his children with him, always." I stared at the photo of my father holding baby me with the same gentle expression I'd seen him wear in pictures with Sarah, Michael and David. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe Dad had been exactly the father we'd wished for, just not in the way we'd expected. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. As I drove home that night, I realized that the storage unit auction hadn't just cost me $70. It had cost me my anger, my resentment, and my certainty about who my father had been. But it had given me something more valuable in return, a family I'd never known I had, and an understanding of love that was messier and more complicated and more generous than anything I'd imagined possible. The storage unit was empty now, its contents distributed among all of us. Photos and memories and evidence of a life lived in service to love, even when love demanded the impossible. And in the end, maybe that was exactly what Robert Thompson had been trying to build all along, a family big enough and strong enough and forgiving enough to hold all the love he had to give, even if it took us 20 years and a $70 storage auction to figure out how to receive it.